I think it's best that I start off with this brief disclaimer. I was not around for the early days of Furry. I just really love and am inspired by Chester. Whenever I had the opportunity present itself, I would try to learn more about him. Now, after years of conversations, reviewing archives, printed material, and artwork, I feel I have a good enough understanding to create this. Any inaccuracies are my fault, and I encourage anyone who would like to contribute or make a correction to please contact me to do so. Thank you so much for watching. It is said something lives only as long as the last person to remember it. Before Furry transformed from a little-known niche in the shadows of culture to a trending topic, and with it coming an ever-shifting sea of pop-furs and characters, there was a man named Chester Magreer. It was 1989, the last year of the greatest decade, and Chester made his public debut to a fandom still in its infancy. Posed against a vanity mirror, he didn't quite look the way he would come to be known. This was Proto-Chester, but within a few short years, this ringtail would explode in popularity, sweeping hearts and minds, propelling furry fandom to new heights of recognition, and his influence would extend far beyond the fandom community. This is the story of the most important furry icon you've likely never heard of. It's the story of how one artist and her beloved character inspired a generation to imagine, create, and dare to dream. At its roots, furry fandom has aided to inspire so much. Not just artistic creativity, but the development of the internet, bold innovations in biotech, and an intellectual revolution of human existence. But the story of furry fandom is inextricably linked to the story of Chester Ringtail. The story of Furry is also the story of Chester. Before going into Chester's world, it's important to take a look at the artist who brought him to life. As a creator, Terry Smith stood out against her contemporaries. Not to say that other artists of the time lacked talent or enthusiasm, but they simply didn't compare to Terry. Her technical skills were one component, but of equal, if not greater importance, was her perspective. Terry's imagination poured forth images of beautiful sensuality, magical fantasy scenes, and sweeping adventure. And she did it all in a way that felt real. It was easy to fall in love with her world. Terry Smith herself details how she had a wonderful childhood in Cape Cod, New England. She always had a passion for art and creativity. Born with this gift, she felt driven to constantly hone her skills, and art school was a clear choice. While Terry attended the University of Tennessee College of Art, she would take walks in her free time, appreciating nature. One creature in particular had a profound effect on Terry. The Basiliscus astutus is a cacomissile in the Procinidae family that encompasses raccoons and civets. Those unfamiliar with the cacomissile tend to mistake it for a type of lemur. These small mammals are sometimes affectionately known as miner's cats, but more often simply as ringtails. The moniker miner's cat originated from the days of the pioneers, when settlers and mine workers befriended the little guys for companionship and pest control. Seeing the happy little golden ring-tailed cats with their playful and outgoing disposition, Terry was inspired. What if there was a ringtail with just enough differences to make him a sentient extraterrestrial life form? This adorable little ringtail raised to the level of intelligent life, combined with the complexity and beauty of the human experience. And very soon there would be the perfect world for such a ringtail to inhabit. In the mid to late 1980s, furries were starting to make a name for themselves in the zine sphere. For those who don't know, a zine is an independently published fantasy work, typically of a science fiction nature. The creative team works very closely to both design and print the issues, which then also have to be marketed on a grassroots level. This method relies almost exclusively on word of mouth and self-driven advertising. There was a growing sentiment in those proto-fandom years that anthropomorphic beings could well exist in outer space. This corresponded with popular culture, beginning to accept the idea of aliens. Not in a cheesy sci-fi movie sort of way, but as an advanced and equally organized life form to our own. Perhaps something that would be strange to us, but perfectly normal and structured in its own environment. The SETI, or Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence Project, had yielded the WOW signal in 1977. It was discovered by researchers at Ohio State, and is perhaps the strongest evidence of intelligent life in the cosmos ever gathered. It remains unable to be satisfactorily explained away as anything of natural or human origin. Brilliant minds such as Carl Sagan and Stephen Hawking explored the concept of aliens from the perspective of complex equations and likely probabilities. The Drake equation, formulated by astrophysicist Frank Drake, opened a discussion on how many advanced civilizations may exist out there, how likely that they could develop advanced communication methods, and for what periods of times the resultant signals could be released to have a chance of being discovered. This was nothing short of inspirational for early furries, such as Fred Patton and Cy Sable, who elaborated on this theme in their literary works. But if cosmic anthros didn't exist now, then they certainly would in the future. In the century 3500 to be exact. Tales of the Taipan universe started off as one humble zine among many, but it would go on to become the most grandiose and longest running of them all. In 1988, a group of furry creators had a discussion while attending Norwescon. This was not a furry convention. The first one of those would take place the following year. At this point, furs still met each other as an offshoot of science fiction or fantasy conventions. During their discussion that weekend, these furs conceived of a sweeping galactic world set in the future. This was a time when storytelling and character development was of equal importance to artwork. Their project would tell the story of a complex post-Earth history that humanity had somehow managed to survive, barely, without wiping itself out. And we were also no longer alone. Recombinant DNA technology had coincided with space exploration, and humans had gene-teched, or raised up, species of animals to be anthropomorphs. Initially, this was pioneered by Carnation Corp., but eventually, as the research proliferated, others followed. True to humanity's history as a whole, we weren't very nice to our creations. Many, including the Earth's religions, despised them, and there were many struggles for equal civil rights. The need to colonize distant planets, as well as a horrific pandemic on Earth, eventually brought about a certain harmony, and now we are living in an age of intergalactic society. Terry Smith was invested in this project, and she worked to create her contribution to the series, Chester Magreer, the ringtail. She had drawn Chester in advance of the series, and when issue 1 finally hit the printers in 1991, Chester was proudly featured on page 3, an illustration that had been done in 1989. I have no way of knowing how many drawings of Chester were done between 1988 and 1991. Sadly, it is likely a lot of early material is lost to time. At this point, the internet was not prevalent enough to allow for preservation. What we can see when looking at the two images that survive from '89 is that Chester looked quite a bit different than he does today. Chester's story was woven in along with other characters who worked aboard the interstellar shipping hauler, the Taipan. The ringtail's job description was a communications officer. He is well versed in computer coding, hacking, and security. This immense literary project was contributed to by many artists and writers, but in a very short time, Chester had already developed a cult following. Something about this guy really grabbed people. This is an archived chat from March of 1995. The Taipan series had to take a temporary hiatus during 1994, prompting concern it was cancelled. This was the context for this discussion, but it isn't long before the subject of Chester comes up. One comment captures the sentiment with, "Watch everyone's Kinsey ratings go boing." Clearly by now, Chester had already become the focus of lust, and that would only get stronger with time. As far as the development of Chester's character, in the end of 1993 he'd gotten a spin-off in the form of Midnight Sonata. This was an anthology zine similar to Taipan, but it only saw 2 issues, and Chester was one of the main characters. I've never been able to read this for myself, and I've always wanted to. I've never been able to find an issue or see more than a few pieces of art that ran inside of it. The overall premise survives, and it was the story of an intergalactic battleship fighting in a war. The Allied Mammalian Federation was locked in combat with the demon races, and Chester served as a combat officer in the AMF military. As I understand it, there was quite a backstory as to how he found himself in military service. Chester's early years were set against the sweeping backdrop of this very same intergalactic demon war. Described as a war of attrition with no real ground gained, It had been going on for a very long time. This war fostered a breeding ground for nefarious, cruel, and immoral activity. This included piracy and slavery, which were a real and ongoing threat. Chester Magreer was from a relatively peaceful society. The ringtails are described as being into free love and friendship. Sex is something they are very open about. It's fun and also a way to show affection. They also tend to like pretty things like jewelry, art, clothes, and the finer things of life. Another quirky and rather cute detail about this species, and Chester in particular, is that chocolate acts as an inebriant. As Terry explains, under the influence of chocolate, Chester loses control. He becomes wild and horny and intoxicated, being rather helpless in such a state and very susceptible to suggestion. Unsurprisingly, cultures such as that of Chester's society make it an easy mark for the more brutal types, and Chester's hometown was raided, resulting in his being captured and taken into slavery when he was still very young, around the age of 12. We do know Chester has a sister, and her name is Sunny, but they haven't seen each other since they were little, prior to Chester's being taken away. A sad irony was that Chester had incredible value because of his beauty. He would end up being used and mistreated as a sex slave or catamite by various underworld figures, including Count Lukash Bakari the Wolverine. This smuggler and criminal held the title of nobleman from the Brass Dominion planet. Count Bakari owned Chester for a period, and during this time Chester, known under aliases Bustifer or Carbonal, was subjected to various conditioning tortures. Fortunately, he was never physically mutilated, likely due to his value and desirability being tied to his remaining completely intact. Nonetheless, he was by no means treated well. Poor Chester was neurologically tormented by procedures referred to as constraint neurotomy and hematoplasty. These helped ensure better compliance and passivity in slaves. The condition of slavery itself was given the cheerful titles of vocational indenture or contractual welfare, and was essentially permitted by many governments at that time. Another purpose of the aforementioned procedures was to make the slaves more sexually malleable. Chester was repeatedly raped and abused during his time as a slave. And this is all the more heartbreaking when you consider Chester's cheerful and affectionate personality. He would much rather love you and have fun with you than have to fight and kill you. But kill is exactly what Chester would be driven to do. As the abuse went on day after day, far from being beaten to submission and broken, brave Chester fought back and killed his owners. The last people to put the ringtail in chains without his consent died for it. I say without his consent because, as an interesting side point, you'll notice at times Chester is depicted as engaging in light bondage. Psychologically speaking, this is not an uncommon way for abuse survivors to regain control over something they were afraid of. I can't be certain if this was an intentional element or simply playing to a fetish fans wanted to see, but the idea of Chester allowing those he trusts to put forms of restraints on him during lovemaking could be a subconscious way to conquer those painful memories and fears. Returning to the timeline, Chester would be placed in jail. Despite being the victim, killing your master and running away was illegal. He managed to escape the prison, running from an unfair justice system that deserved no respect. Ultimately, he ended up in a company of pirates. As a pirate, Chester Magreer's enemies fell before him, and he showed no mercy to those who sought to participate in oppression or injustice. The ringtail was good at evading capture, and had a good run. Eventually, he was recaptured and sentenced to be executed. His beauty and charm carried no weight with his judges, nor did his tragic past. In a twist of luck, a previous love interest intervened on his behalf. This was a princess, whose father happened to be not only a powerful monarch, but also in the high command of the Allied Mammalian government. Chester Magreer's death sentence was commuted to compulsory military service in the Allied Mammalian Federation on an interstellar battleship. This is the time frame of the Midnight Sonata zine, during the final days of the Demon Wars. It was on this same vessel that Chester would meet Canine, Ural Christophe Deck, who became the ringtail's boyfriend, closest companion, and eventual business partner. After witnessing the hopelessness of the war, with its seemingly pointless death and destruction, eventually the entire crew decided to go AWOL. Not long after this, an armistice was declared, meaning they were now free of any military obligation. Deciding to make a fresh start, Chris and Chester stayed together. They each filled a need for the other and found love and happiness in each other's company. Chester, still hedonistic and polyamorous in his attractions, has an open relationship with Deck. However, Chris is who he always comes home to. Chris Deck hadn't been a stranger to pain and suffering, not necessarily to the extent Chester had, but we learn Chris had an evil older brother named Koji who wanted to kill him. Chris had also fallen in with a really bad crowd, a rogue mercenary type outfit called the Lion Circle that engaged in criminal conduct for pay. This is revisited later when a crazed ex-girlfriend going by the name Knife tries to kill them both. Together, these two former combat officers bought a large spaceship of their own, the Half Moon, and began Havoc Inc. shipping, the eponymous title of the comic series. Havoc Inc. was instantly loved, and not just by furries. By this time, the ringtail was very well received and recognized. He continued to feature in Tales of the Taipan universe, not to mention numerous cameos, commissions, and anthologies, each outing adding another element to Chester's personality. In the Taipan special issue Rough Trade, we get a glimpse of Chester as a father. In those days, Furry frequently tackled really tough themes, and the story A Good Year was particularly dark. Chester falls in love with a girl named Jerusha, a drug-addicted lynx who just joined the Taipan crew with her brother Harvard. Jerusha remained clean long enough to get the job, but ultimately tried to stay so when she made friends on the ship. Chester's charm, humor, and compassion inspired her to be better. Instead of being happy for his sister, Harvard became filled with hatred, because he had come to see her as something more, and had started to sexually abuse his sister when she was in a drug-addled state. The more Jerusha realized how evil Harvard truly was, the more she wanted away from him. Unfortunately, she didn't think to warn Chester. By the time it was revealed Jerusha was pregnant, Chester was ready to raise the child and be there for her. This was an incredible sacrifice for a bisexual polyamorous ringtail, especially when you consider Chester didn't know if the child was his. In fact, the odds were against it, since he was of a different species. Jerusha was afraid it was in fact her brother's child. Harvard directed all his rage at the ringtail, and like the cowardly abuser he was, snuck into Chester's room while he slept. By the time he realized he was under attack, it was too late. Chester fought back, but was repeatedly stabbed in the abdomen while doing so. It would have been a sad end for Chester, after all he'd survived to be murdered by a drug-addicted incestuous abuser. Fortunately, the Taipan has excellent medical care, and Chester was found quickly. Still, it was really close. As for the disgusting and cowardly Harvard, he ended up killing himself while hiding in an airlock. We are left with a scene of Chester holding Jerusha's newborn. Poor Chester is still in a hospital bed 4 months later, so there must have been considerable damage. The medical remedies available at this time include regeneration, and this very well may have been necessary. The baby turned out to be the result of an encounter she'd had with a random bobcat while on a furlough. Despite Chester still being willing to help, Jerusha decides to leave, determining a space transport isn't a good place to raise a baby. This is an understandable point, but sadly it's also the end of her relationship with Chester, who is brutally attacked for loving her. Chester would go on to adopt a child with Chris during their time in the military. Her name is Lammy, and she's a cute, happy, and precocious mouse girl. She was also orphaned as the result of a cruel corporation murdering her researcher father. He had developed an atomic-powered artificial heart for his daughter, who was born with congenital heart issues. Celesticorp wanted to take it from her, which would of course result in her death. Chester hid her on board their ship, and together with Chris they adopted her as their own. She appears in Havoc Inc. issues 6, 7, and 8. And speaking of Havoc, the most recent release was in 2019, just prior to COVID. In it, the story arc from 2001 finally concluded, and I am hoping against all hope there will be future installments. Another idea that's popped up from time to time is the idea of Havoc Inc. adapted to an animated series or movie. I am certain this would explode in popularity, but a barrier is of course the required funding and need of studio cooperation. Mark Bernard, series writer and extremely talented in his own right, has generated dozens of scripts for the series. Sadly, the majority of these have not seen publication due to the difficulties and costs associated with indie comic publishing. According to Mark, there is a planned continuation called Crime Plus. In this, bad financial decisions and the resulting outcome force Chris and Chester to resort back to criminal enterprises and high-stakes thievery. Ironically, it seems the coup de grace was Chris making a bad business bet that cost them their ship. High-stakes thievery would be something that Chester was very good at, with his background in piracy, along with an assortment of useful skills including sleight-of-hand theft, breaking and entering, and of course, the art of seduction as a diversion. Chris Dack, on the other hand, reverts to a more unpredictable nature. Instead of being the responsible one, he's described as being more of a loose cannon at this stage. This is something I would very much like to see go to print. However, as far as I know, it remains in the idea stage. I'm not giving up hope, though. Chester's sartorial influence is very much the 1980s, along with his classic sense of cool. Chester typically presents as an effeminate and flamboyant, the original femboy in the fandom. That term really wasn't in use then. Indeed, he set the baseline. There are a few instances where Chester is referred to derisively as a fruit or a fairy, the overall connotation being Chester is stereotypically homosexual. As Chester's popularity proliferated, the entire furry art scene followed suit. There are scores of male characters imitating his style, his poses, his occasional casual wearing of female clothes. The modern furry practice of commissions, and what's now commonly referred to as your character here, took root with Chester and Terry Smith. All through the 1990s and beyond, furries clamored to have their characters drawn with Chester, and the ringtail himself became the gold star standard for what a gay man looks like in the fandom. This image is somewhat deceiving, however, for several reasons. In the first place, Chester is not gay, he's bisexual. This doesn't mean he isn't worthy of his place as an iconic rainbow character, but it is an important distinction, because despite the if you suck it you're gay crowd, that is not how that works. Chester likes women too. Another important point is that Chester's proclivity to cross-dress is surprisingly not drag. He's not a transvestite or a suppressed transsexual. As Terry had previously explained, he wears what he likes and what he thinks makes him look good. This is a very 1980s notion, seen quite a bit by musical groups or actors of the time. Think Twisted Sister, Kaja Gugu, or Culture Club, for example. Chester isn't thinking, I want to look like a girl, he just thinks, I like this, looks neat. All the same, this apparently did lead to some confusion early on, with some thinking that he was in fact a female. Another distinction is that as a military combat veteran, former mercenary and pirate, Chester is not a subby little bitch. While he certainly would much rather be friends and possibly sleep with you, if you cross him or the need arises, he will meet any threat with lethal force without hesitation. Additional archive chats from series co-creator and Terry Smith's husband, Glenn Wooten, elaborate on this. The context of this chat is a hypothetical fight between Chester and Roz Gibson's Jack Salem. For those who may be unaware, Jack Salem is a Russian sable marten and cat hybrid. He is also a deranged and savage monster, engaging in serial killings and rapes. A dark and disturbed character by design, his exploits fall more so under the furry crime genre, which his character in large part established. Were the two to meet, Chester would prove to be an equal threat to the predator. Series writer Mark Bernard explains that Chester is also surprisingly strong, owing to the gene-tech traits of his species. A trained combat officer with the body count to match, Chester can take out Salem. You wouldn't expect it from looking at the sweet and swishy ringtail, but appearances can be deceiving. This may be part of the reason a detachment of the United States Air Force wanted Chester depicted on planes used during the Gulf War. This ultimately was not authorized, but it would have been awesome to see. All the same, Chester laid the groundwork for what a cute little sissy femboy should look like. Chester's world blended the lighthearted with the more serious, like the time Chester was entrusted to protect a young prince from harm, or when a shape-shifting assassin impersonated Chester to try and kill Deck. Sadly, this caused the canine to have PTSD and fear his partner for a period of time. Other stories verged on the silly, like an evening of lucha libre wrestling turned into mistaken identity chaos. This is relatable to the ups and downs of real life for any of us. Sure, the individual stories and paths may change, but things aren't always sunshine and rainbows, nor are they always storm clouds and rain. One of the main reasons Chester is such a beloved character is because we get to know him and share in his life story. I think there is no single person you could point to and say, that is the founder of furry fandom. It was more like a core group that found each other at a special place and time, and by inspiring and validating each other brought this community to life. The artwork and characters they created became like the foundation of a building. I would argue that Chester is the strongest part of that foundation, if not the entirety of it. I don't say this to detract from the accomplishments or contributions of Steve Galachi, Warbrazzle, the Skill Tear, or anyone else from that era. I have nothing but the utmost respect and admiration for these early furries. Instead of simply discussing anthropomorphic creations of big studios, they were beginning to generate their own content. A fandom by furries for furries. Unlike other fandoms like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, or what have you, furries built their world from scratch. It became an environment everyone could contribute to. But of these early creations, Chester accelerated into a class all his own. He became a galvanizing force, something everyone could be proud of, admire, and yes, lust over. When fursuits were still new and highly developmental, Chester was one of the first. This is the moment Terry Smith saw Chester standing before her as a fursuit. Yes, it isn't much to look at by today's standards, but consider this. The incredibly intricate fursuits you've all come to love were born out of these early moments. A furry who was so inspired by Terry and her Chester that he built this. If you think designing a fursuit is challenging now, imagine doing it in the mid-90s. This fursuit would be worn by Dr. Samuel Conway, known in furry fandom as Uncle Kage. Also a fan of Terry Smith and Chester Magreer, he's none other than the chairperson of Anthrocon. That convention is one of the largest in the world, with an attendance in 2023 of over 13,000. Years later, another approved-upon version of the fursuit was constructed. Unlike other early works, Chester became an institution, a franchise unto himself. He was a household name for us that empowered an emerging fandom in a new way. Chester was the catalyst, the jumping-off point for furries to advance to the next level. Before we had a flood of popufurs, cultural references, and inside jokes, he was like a force that pulled everyone together. Just seeing that striped, bushy tail was enough to make everyone's heart rate increase. Chester became a bridge. Even normies liked him or felt an innate attraction. When asked, "What's your fandom have?" or "What's an example of a furry?" individual furries could proudly show off the ringtail. And for all that, this ringtail should always hold a special place in the fandom and not be forgotten. His determination and struggle against profound trauma and adversity to find happiness. His bravery fighting against oppression. His unbroken spirit. Chester Magreer has a depth of character not often seen in the fandom nowadays. More than a pretty face, this ringtail serves as an inspiration. I want to believe that Chester is out there, somewhere in space, when I look up at the night sky. Or at the very least, to think he'll exist one day,